Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host, and I'm here in our new radio studio with the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Brandon, it's always a joy to be with you, and especially here, our first time recording in our new studio, in our Word on Fire headquarters in lovely Santa Barbara. So when I was named auxiliary bishop and I was sent out here to the Santa Barbara region, my residence is right near this beautiful mission. And to make a long story short, we decided to move, the real leadership and production side of Word on Fire here. And so we're in a lovely spot on the campus of the Santa Barbara mission. And I just couldn't be happier. And we built it out now as an office and a studio. So we're recording from that place today.
One of the things that's excited me the most about opening up this Word on Fire office here, of all places, is that this mission was established by one of the great evangelists of the Americas, St. Junipero Serra. Talk about the significance of that, of opening an office right where he began his evangelistic work.
I'll tell you something. This is now about 10 months ago. I had just gotten here, and I met with one of the officials of the Franciscan province out here in California. And we were talking about a number of things, financial and institutional. And he himself said, you've got this ministry of Word on Fire, and I wonder if you ever think of moving it out here. And he said, we've got, some space at the mission. And I frankly had never thought about that at that point. And he's the one that made that connection. He said, the missions were built by Sarah and his disciples to evangelize the totally unevangelized culture of the time. Now, we're all about the new evangelization. And he said, Word on Fire is part of that. And it would sort of, participate in the classic mission of this place. And I said, yeah, that's kind of a cool idea. And honestly, it was the first time I thought of it. But then as the year has gone by, we moved in that direction. And I agree. I was visiting the grave of Junipero Serra several months ago. He's up in Carmel. And thought of this, intrepid missionary building these places at a time when it was really difficult to do that. And now we've got a new sort of challenge to evangelize. So I'm delighted that we're here in this historic place.
Today we're going to be discussing the topic of something you've coined Beige Catholicism. Beige Catholicism. It shows up in a lot of your books and writings. There was a recent interview that you did where they titled it, How Not to Be a Beige Catholic. Let's start off by just defining that phrase. So what is Beige Catholicism?
Yeah, it's a phrase I started using many years ago when I first got back from my doctoral studies and began as a writer and a speaker. It's a phrase that I used. I remember Father Andrew Greeley, who is my fellow Chicago priest, sort of picked it up, and he began to write about it and talk about it. If people knew my name early on, it was probably because of that phrase, Beige Catholicism. What I mean by it and meant by it is a Catholicism that's become bland, that's become apologetic, unsure of itself, hand-wringing, overly accommodating, that's allowed its distinctive colors to bleed into beige. So it's hard to distinguish it from other religions, hard to distinguish it from the wider culture. That's what I was worrying about. And it was the Catholicism I thought had been produced by the post-conciliar period, by the poor reception of the council. The church that I grew up with, the church of the 70s and 80s, I saw it mirrored and expressed actually in the very beige, literally beige buildings that we built. Church structures that looked like, they belonged in a shopping mall, or they were hardly distinguishable from the suburban environment. You go inside, they look like a bank, or they look like a shopping mall or something. And that to me became symbolic of this deeper issue of a Catholicism that's lost its purpose, energy, confidence, color, distinctiveness, its sharp edges dulled, its distinctive colors muted. And so that's the phrase that I use to describe this really problematic instantiation of the church after the council.
Now, the history of the church is full of color, verve, sharpness, all the things that are opposite of beige Catholicism. You wouldn't classify Michelangelo or Chartres or Dante as beige Catholic. So where did this beige Catholicism arise? What are some of its historical or theological roots?
Yeah, you go way back to the beginning of really of the modern period philosophically, and the option for a very subjectivized and experiential reading of religion. And go back to people like Descartes and Kant and Schleiermacher and Hegel and many others. Come up into our century or last century with Paul Tillich and Karl Rahner. And what you get is an approach to Christianity which emphasizes what it has in common with all the great kind of religions and spiritualities. And again, nothing really wrong with that in itself, but when that becomes sort of consistently the point of departure or the point of orientation, what you hear is like, oh yeah, Christianity or Catholicism, it's a spiritual path like many others. Many ways up the holy mountain, that's one of the ways. Oh yeah, it's a lot like, Buddhism, or it's like New Age spirituality, or it's like whatever. And that was born of the more typically modern experiential approach that emphasized the universality of all religions. See, it's a very interesting thing, because the moderns, to give them their credit, give them their due, look at the Kants and Leibniz's and Hegel's and Kant's, they were worried that religions were warring with each other, and they were battling over their distinctive theologies. And so one way around the wars of religion, they thought, was to emphasize, perhaps in a hyper way, the universal dimension. Okay, as far as it goes, but when you do that to such a degree, it will produce this kind of bland or watered down Catholicism.
Now, you've written that above all, Beige Catholicism is concerned with accommodating itself to the surrounding culture. Why is this a bad approach, and how should Catholics properly relate to the culture?
It's a very important question, isn't it? Because the culture-religion dialogue, I would say, dominated the conversation when I was a young man and when I was coming of age as a theologian, a student of theology. But how often it seemed as though it was always the church reaching out to the culture and not vice versa. So the call for culture dialogue was coming almost exclusively from the church. I didn't hear a lot of the avatars of the culture interested in making themselves understandable to us on our terms, reaching out to find points of contact with religion. It seemed like it was always religion that was accommodating itself to the culture. Now, put that in terms of a slogan I heard a lot when I was a young man, which was, the world sets the agenda for the church. That's simply not the case. Vatican II called us to read the signs of the times. See, and boy, was that phrase used, trust me, to produce a lot of Beige Catholicism. It was taken to mean, see what's going on around you, and then become like that. No, the point is not to accommodate; it's to read them. Read them in light of the gospel, with the lens of the gospel. What you're going to find, indeed, are seeds of the word. You're going to find good things. You'll know how to interpret the good things. You're also going to find lots of bad things in the culture. The point is, the culture is not the interpretive lens for the church, but rather vice versa. And Christ, precisely as the Logos, not just one among many, like, Aristotle says true things, and Plato says true things, and the Buddha has true things. Christ is the Logos of the Father, which means, from an epistemological standpoint, he's that which can't be trumped. He can't be outmaneuvered. He can't be positioned by our higher point of vantage. Everything must be read through him. He can't be read from the standpoint of something else. That's the problem that produces Beige Catholicism, is when you say, oh yeah, Jesus, he's great, he's really interesting, he's like so many others, and this and that. You've read him now from a vantage point higher than himself. You've put him, Karl Barth would put it this way, as one religious figure among many, as I often say. That's the formula for producing Beige Catholicism.
The Beige Catholicism often includes, as you note, the domestication of Jesus. You use that phrase a lot. What do you mean by domesticating him?
Well, it's always just what I was saying. Make him easy to understand, to make him like other figures. We can easily compare and contrast. We can find points of contact. I get Jesus. He's a spiritual guru. He's a spiritual teacher. He's a philosopher. Go through all the books on Jesus. He's a Jewish mystic. He's like the Sufi mystics or whatever. So you're trying to get a handle on him. When I like Balthazar, I would say Jesus is like this rushing mountain stream that can't be controlled, that overwhelms our attempts to control. He positions us. He interprets us. It's not you who've chosen me, it's I who've chosen you. See, that's a huge difference. There's the holy mountain. Here's a great teacher taught me a way up the mountain. You found a way with your teacher, and let's walk together by our different path. I mean, fine as far as it goes, but that's not biblical Christianity. It's just not biblical religion. Biblical religion is, God's not just kind of blandly waiting for us to find him. Rather, he's the hound of heaven, is after us. The Father so loved the world, he sent his only Son, who entered into our space and affected something and changed us. He invaded us with his grace. See, and all that language is a bit repugnant to a beige approach that wants to say, no, we're all kind of, walking different paths to the same goal. And so that's what I mean by a domesticated Jesus. I want the ferocious Christ that Chesterton talks about. That there's the gentle Christ, of course. But he said next to that there should be a statue of the ferocious Christ, And there should. There should. The Christ that overwhelms us, that shocks us, that puzzles us, that turns us into disciples. Do you know what I'm saying? He's the master. We're the disciples. Anyway, I think all of that is very much congruent with a beige Catholicism.
One of my favorite images of the undomesticated Jesus is what C.S. Lewis gives us in the Chronicles of Narnia in the figure of Aslan.
Yeah.
And in particular, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's a moment when one of the characters asks, is he safe?
Yeah.
And the response is, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he's not safe, but he is good.
Yeah.
And I always like that there's something dangerous about Jesus because he comes into, to use your language, to invade your life, not in a domineering way, but he wants all of you, doesn't he? Yeah,
you know better than I. You know Lewis so well, but he's not a tame
lion.
He's not a tame cat. He's this great cat, and he's here to do enormous good. But get your seatbelts. I mean, you're not dealing with a little domestic cat that you can put in your lap and pet, and everything's fine. Here's my little cat. No, he's a dangerous figure, and that's very much congruent too with the book we've both been reading recently, Fleming Rutledge's book on the crucifixion. Because it's trying to de-domesticate the crucifixion too, and how deeply weird the crucifixion is. And that's why my book from a long time ago called The Strangest Way, I was trying to get at that of all the religious traditions, the strangest is this deeply weird one that says at the heart of the matter is a 30-year-old man being brutally put to death on an instrument of torture, and to say that's God. I submit to you, say what you want about Christianity. The one thing you can't say about that is, oh yeah, that's an ordinary spirituality, or that's what we'd all expect. That's the weirdest dish on offer. Of all the religious offerings, that's the weirdest one, I would submit. Now you might say, yeah, and it's also false. Okay, but at least don't tell me it's something predictable and domesticated.
We've both been watching the show Vikings, and I think you see through that show how the pagan culture, even though their religion is based on myths that we, of course, wouldn't subscribe to, it's nevertheless not beige. It's full of color and excitement. Things happen, that you experience danger and the sense of the numinous. I think that's where guys like Lewis and Chesterton and Tolkien, who tapped into these myths, realized that the Christianity needs a dose of that,
Yes, and speaking of Vikings, that scene that we both talked about when Floki, who's kind of he's the more religious, mystical kind of Viking, comes into a Christian church for the first time in England, and he sees the image of the dead Jesus on the cross. And he's like, what good is that? I mean, that's their God? This dead man on a cross? I mean, what possible good could he do? But what I loved about this scene was, yeah, he's right. In other words, think about that. What a deeply weird thing that is to put up in your religious space. And how it's not like, oh yeah, any religion would come up with that. No, on the contrary. No religion would come up with that. That's the weirdest thing you've ever seen. But again, go back to Beige Catholicism. Oh, the cross, there's the dying and rising God. We find that in all the different myths and legends. I mean, come on. That's a very superficial grasp of what the cross really means. Floki's reaction is the right one. Like, I don't get this at all. This is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. Good. Follow that weirdness all the way, and you'll get to what we mean by Jesus.
Now, you've said that Beige Catholicism also typically involves the flattening of the sacramental worldview. Why is this bad, and what does a full, colorful, sacramental vision look like?
Yeah, it looks like that God lurks in all things, and God, who's the ground of being, is available in and through all things, and that we like the material world. This is a pet theory of mine, and we could talk about it some other time, but I think modernity is very much haunted by Gnosticism. I think in some ways modernity, I go back to Descartes and Kant and company, is a neo-Gnostic movement.
Let's define term. What do you mean by modernity here?
Well, modernity is the philosophical movement that comes up out of these major figures. There's a beginning in the late 16th century and then moving up through, especially into the 18th and 19th centuries. So figures like Hegel and Leibniz and Spinoza and Schleiermacher and Thomas Jefferson would be typical moderns, But one of the marks of the modern is a suspicion of the supernatural and a hyper-valorization of the physical sciences. And so what you get there is a kind of privileging of one realm over the other. The sacramental is a very integrated view of life, and that's what you find in the medievals. You find that in Aquinas. The integration of the spiritual and material, of the natural and the supernatural, of faith and reason, all these great both ands that I keep insisting on. I think a lot of that broke apart at modernity. Now that's, again, read my book, The Strangest Way, for details, or The Priority of Christ, I go into even more detail. And that's been really bad for us. And a lot of the postmodern thing that I like is an attempt to knit back together things that have fallen apart. The sacramental view of the world is deeply both and, because this very grubby physical thing can be also a portal into a higher world. It can also be a sign of a higher dimension. And the two of them are read together. So that's a Catholic view.
And we've spent a lot of time here critiquing Beige Catholicism. I think most of us listening to this know it when we see it, when we see the beige, banal, flattened out Catholicism. But I want to conclude here with the opposite. What does it look like when Beige Catholicism is washed away? So if you had a paintbrush and you could add color to the beige Catholic world, what would it look like? So paint us a picture here of the opposite of Beige Catholicism.
It would look like a Catholic world that's deeply Christological, that sees Jesus as an extremely distinctive figure, that brings forward the cross and resurrection in their both brutality and wonder, that's deeply sacramental, that sees God available in the physical world, that's not afraid to use the signs and symbols of the great Catholic tradition, that's confident in the culture conversation, that it doesn't go hat in hand to the culture, it doesn't pander to the culture. But there's a phrase I always like from Paul Tillich, the German theologian, that the church should go out mit klingendem Spiel, he says in his German, which hard to translate, but something like with fife and drum. It goes out with confidence, That's a colorful Catholicism that is confident in its own identity and integrity, is not afraid of the world, and is willing to engage it, but on its own terms, So sacramental, liturgical, deeply Christological, emphasizing the both and, avoiding the Gnostic temptation. Those are all the marks of a colorful Catholicism.
Would you say that in some ways your great Catholicism series was designed to be an answer to this beige Catholicism?
Yes. I remember it wasn't the series here, but the John Paul II Chapel at Mundelein Seminary when I was rector. And the Mundelein Seminary Chapel for many, many years was a paragon of beige Catholicism. I mean, it was just this very emptied out space, no decoration really. Well, when I was rector, then we raised the money and we really redesigned it with 19 stained glass windows and with all kinds of color and distinctiveness. That one of the faculty members who been there forever, taught me, he's been there for a long time. He said, well, this is Bob Barron's definitive no to beige Catholicism. And I said, right, I hope it's remembered that way. This is a chapel of colorful Catholicism.
Well, it's time now for our regular listener question. We love to hear from you. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, just visit askbishopbarron.com and you can record your question on whatever device you're using. Today we have a great question from Bill. He asks about a popular proposal in the media today in reaction to a culture that seems to be closing in around Christians. So here's Bill with his question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. I'm Bill from Silicon Valley. I wanted to know if you had any opinion on Rod Dreher's idea of a Benedict Option for American Christians, and what you would recommend to Catholics who are attracted to it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The Benedict Option, so named both for Saint Benedict, but also in a way for Pope Benedict. And if I can summarize it very briefly, and I'm sure inadequately, but that there's something to be said for withdrawing from the culture to find your own kind of integrity, identity, apart from the culture, so that the church doesn't simply become a subset of the wider culture. It's a very conscious, intentional recovery of Catholic Christian identity apart from the culture. I remember Pope Benedict talked about the church maybe should become smaller, so that it might then become more effective in the future, etc. So Rod Dreher, you're right, sort of formally lays that out, and there's been a lot of debate around it. I guess I'd give my classic both and answer to it. There is something to be said, and this whole program about beige Catholicism and the need to recover a colorful Catholicism, in some ways, is the Benedict Option. It's to say, let's step back from a hyper accommodationism. Let's make sure we know who we are on our own terms. So, yeah, that, I think, moment is always called for in the life of the church. Otherwise, we will just become a subset of the wider culture. We'll be assimilated to the wider culture. But see, here's the key thing, and I think Dreher would agree with this. I know Pope Benedict would too. In the Bible, people are chosen all the time. This rather than that, this person rather than that, Israel rather than the nations. However, it's never a kind of exclusive choice. Rather, someone or a people is chosen for the sake of the whole. So Israel is set apart. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. And to be defined over and against the other nations, that's really important in the Bible. Whenever you find a line like, and they started acting like the other nations, that's never a good thing in the Bible, right? So Israel is set apart, holy, which, that's the core meaning of that term. But it's never set apart to exult in its own distinctiveness. It's set apart so as to become a missionary to the whole world. So I would say that yes to the Benedict Option if you mean to prepare ourselves better to evangelize the world, So in other words, we're not opting for a sort of cultic little enclave. Let's withdraw from the world so we can live in the hills by ourselves away from this awful culture. No, discover who you are, so that now you can go out with confidence. So our purpose is a missionary purpose. It always is. I've used the image of Noah's Ark, right? Noah preserved a form of life on the ark, but then he let the life out. So the church is like Noah's Ark. And God knows our culture can seem an awful like the flood, and so we do need to hunker down to a degree. We need to get on the ark and make sure we know who we are. But then that ark will come to rest and time to let out the life. So that's, I think, the right way to get at the Benedict Option.
Coincidentally, we're here talking about the Benedict Option, and you've spent the last couple days writing and researching about St. Benedict. We're hoping to feature St. Benedict in the next round of our film series, Catholicism, the Pivotal Players. How did St. Benedict himself make these moves? How did he take the option himself?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? And you're right. I was just finishing the script, which I hope someday we'll get around to filming. Benedict lived at a time of tremendous cultural crisis because the Roman Empire falls in 476. He's born, they say, either 480 or 490, around there. So in the immediate wake of the worst cultural collapse in centuries. The Roman order was gone. And so what did Christians do? Well, he sort of sets this tone. Let's stand apart from this very decadent, unfocused culture. Let's very consciously live a life very intentionally focused on Jesus, on the virtues, he talks about the monastery being a school of the virtues. Beautiful, and he taught them the ways of community and poverty and humility and obedience, and he formed them, shaped them. But then what? See, read the church not just moment to moment, but across time. Those Benedictine monasteries that began, in the ruins of the Roman Empire, eventually civilized Europe. And that's no exaggeration to say. A lot of the villages, cities, towns came from the Benedictine monasteries. The monks invaded, if you want, the secular space, and they shaped it, So that's the Benedict option. It's a missionary option, ultimately. Do we need something like that today? Maybe. Maybe a renewal of monasticism, a new form of it. But it's never to hunker down permanently. It's never to be sectarian. It's always to be missionary.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. A couple of things. First, make sure that you've ordered your copy of Catholicism, The Pivotal Players. It's our next huge film series. It's the follow-up to Bishop Barron's Catholicism series. We're so excited about it. You can learn more and order your copy at pivotalplayers.com. Also, next week, our new assistant content director, Joe Glore, is going to be hosting the show, and he'll be talking with Bishop Barron about Dante's Divine Comedy. You're going to love Joe. He's an English teacher. He knows a lot about Dante, and he'll be a great host for you. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.